Senate and House Republicans, along with school officials and law enforcement officers, recently called for the repeal of a new law that restricts school resource officers from using certain physical restraints on students.
The consequences of the new law that is concerning, that you have heard about and you will hear more about this morning, that is being pushed through our schools, it is actually pushing our school resource officers out of the districts, such as Moorhead, Anoka, Coon Rapids, Andover, Rockford, Redwood Falls, St. Louis County, and others that are still making their decisions.
Under the current law, there are questions regarding the role of SROs, which restricts their ability to use force or use of restraints. The potential impact to Centennial is the possibility of our school resource agreements being suspended and SROs being pulled out of our schools. In turn, this may have an impact on the safety and security measures in place at our schools.
The only time force is acceptable is when there is a threat of bodily harm or death. Okay? There's a lot of situations that come up where the threat of bodily harm or death may not be immediate, but they're an escalating situation. Some examples of that may be, let's say there's a student who's been expelled who's trespassing, or at a football game. We may have 3, 4, 5, 6 officers working at a football game. We have students that are being disorderly, maybe throwing bottles out on the field, causing a ruckus. Generally, what we will try to do is get them to leave or trespass them from the school property. We cannot do that physically. We actually would have to call officers in off the street who are governed by other rules in this statute to manage that situation then. So the cops are calling the cops.
When I hear the chief come up here and describe the fact that he and other agencies are having to look at workarounds, are having to try to establish police patrolling zones rather than having SROs in buildings where they can immediately diffuse situations, keep people safe, and deter and prevent instances from escalating. That's what we're talking about here. That's what we want to reset to.
Joining me now in the studio is the lead Republican for the Senate Education Policy Committee, Senator Zach Duckworth. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
For the sake of our viewers, explain the role of a school resource officer, a general overview of who they are and what they do.
Sure. So school resource officers have been in many schools throughout the state of Minnesota for decades. They partner with the school administrators and staff to help students succeed, make sure the school buildings are safe, and meet the needs of both students and staff. That could be anything from handling emergencies to giving classes on the side effects or harmfulness of drugs. It could be helping to identify those that are in need of mental health resources. It could also be addressing behavioral issues. The bottom line is school resource officers exist and are in school buildings to keep kids, teachers, and the schools safe. And often they do that by building very strong relationships with those in those buildings to prevent things from even happening.
A new provision in law attempts to set a strict standard whereby use of force or certain restraints cannot be used on students except under extreme circumstances. Are law enforcement officials telling you that the new law goes too far and that at times they do need to have the use of these restraints as an option?
Sure. The thing I've heard from most law enforcement officials isn't necessarily that the law goes too far. In fact, they say they don't want to harm kids at all. That's not why they got into law enforcement. They got in to serve and protect kids of all people. What they are saying is that it's unclear. There's ambiguity there that they need to get resolved, and unfortunately, because the law as it stands isn't clear, many of them have had to be pulled out of buildings. So the request or the ask is simple. Add clarity to the law so they can return those school resource officers to those buildings and prevent others from having to be pulled out. I can't underscore the importance of folks understanding law enforcement, police, they don't want to harm your kids. They want to protect them, and they are more protected when these school resource officers are in those school buildings.
My understanding is that police officers who are not school resource officers are able to use restraints under, circumstances that require, because they are governed by a different set of standards. This law change applies specifically to people who work in schools. Is the rationale that school resource officers should then be more like, community service people or neighborhood watch people, so they don't necessarily have the same authority as police, but are there as a calming presence, and then police would be called if it were warranted?
I don't know for certain if that is the exact rationale. I'll put it to you this way. I am an optimist. I like to believe everybody's well-intended, and I would say perhaps that is the intention of the law, to still have school resource officers there or nearby so they can help if an emergency were to arise. But I think we'd be kidding ourselves if we didn't also understand that some folks simply don't want school resource officers, law enforcement in school buildings, which I personally think is the wrong answer. And here's the deal. If a school district doesn't want that relationship currently, they can decide not to have it. We don't need to mandate that at the state level, okay? But what school resource officers do is, when seconds matter, they step in and they provide safety, oftentimes preventing and deterring something from even escalating. I think if you go back to 2020 or 21, there was an incident specifically in Minnesota in which a school resource officer intervened and clearly prevented a situation from escalating, which could have been very detrimental. And here's the other thing. We don't know how many things haven't occurred because a school resource officer was in a building or nearby. And that's a scary thing to think about, but at the end of the day, we know if they're there, our schools, kids, teachers will be safer without a question.
Are school resource officers trained similarly to police officers, but they just have a mission that's slightly different?
Yeah, so many school resource officers have been former law enforcement officers that you would think of in the typical role of their assignments and duties, and now they've been assigned to a school. So they're highly trained. They know what they can and can't do. And then they've also received specialized training specific to working in the school. And a lot of that has to do with de-escalating, identifying potential issues, building relationships with students. And here's what people don't understand. Another role of school resource officers. They coach and mentor kids often who are in most need of that to keep them on the right path. There are so many students whose lives, whose stories could have been dramatically different had they not had a positive relationship and connection with the school resource officer. Folks, we don't want to see that go away in the state of Minnesota. We really don't.
The concern over school resource officers provides perhaps a micro view of what is occurring in larger cities across the country. The desire among some citizens for tougher police action to rein in crime, while other citizens desire more community services to tackle crime. When it comes to schools, where everyone does want teachers and students to be safe, is there a middle ground between these two approaches?
I sure hope so. I think you just said it. Everybody wants to see our schools, our kids, and our teachers be as safe as possible. It's been a little disheartening to see stuff on social media or what have you that say, well, Democrats don't want our schools to be safe, or Republicans and law enforcement just want to harm kids. Neither of those is true. Both Republicans and Democrats and our law enforcement, more importantly, moms and dads, want to see our schools safe. They want to see our kids safe. And I think if there's a middle ground that needs to be struck regarding some obscure bill language to do that and to make sure school resource officers are there, we'll do it. This doesn't have to be partisan. As a matter of fact, it should be bipartisan. And we've had plenty of time to get the language ironed out that we need to. Every day that goes by when kids are in school is another day in which those schools are less safe. And they could be much safer, obviously. And so let's get it passed. Let's do the right thing and get some clarity brought into the situation in a bipartisan manner so that we know exactly what kids and parents can expect.
So you mentioned that your proposed legislation would repeal the new law restricting restraints and that it does have bipartisan support. Attorney General Keith Ellison's office has said that the law change allows for the use of reasonable force, though some are saying that his statement is still unclear or ambiguous. Governor Tim Walz said he is open to a special session. He said that just over the weekend. So are you beginning to hear from more lawmakers whose school districts may be impacted? It seems that there's sort of a groundswell happening here. Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what I feel. I think we are seeing a groundswell, to use your term, of folks realizing, hey, I think also, too, it has grown as more schools and districts have seen those school resource officers be removed from their buildings. At first, it was a handful, then it was a dozen, and now I've lost count of how many have had them removed. So I think phones are ringing, emails are being received. And here's what I'll say. I ran to serve in the Senate because I felt it's important to be of service and bring about common sense change, and we have opportunities to do so. This is an example of that. It's not a Republican issue or a Democrat issue. This is a chance for all of us to come together on a common sense issue and do some bipartisan work. I think that's growing. The governor came out and said he's open to it. I know that I've worked with colleagues in the Senate who are genuinely interested in seeing a solution here. If we can get House members, specifically Democrats in the House, to also be on board and work with us, we could have that language by the end of this week passed via a special session, and we could have school resource officers back in schools in no time. And that's really what we need to do.
And one more thing before I let you go, because we are back to school now. Everybody's kids are back in school. In late August, the Department of Education released testing data for 2023 that showed that in math and science, less than half of Minnesota students meet or exceed standards, while just over half, 50.4%, meet or exceed in reading. These are three key areas, and basically half of Minnesota students are still struggling. What would you like to see done to address this?
Sure, and I appreciate you asking the question because it's extremely important. As a former school board member, I would often say in meetings when we were looking at test scores and things of that nature that nobody's here to beat up on anybody, right? I'm not here to criticize teachers, administrators, what have you. We need to look at where we stand, where our kids are, make some accurate assessments, and then move on from there. And that's the importance of these results. To me, it underscores, I think, something that you've probably heard from me, which is a broken record, that we need to get back to the fundamentals: reading, writing, math, science. We spent this whole last session talking about education and passing all sorts of different mandates and ideas that now school districts and teachers are going to have to try to wade their way through. And everything that we ask of a teacher, everything that we require of a school district comes at a cost. Sometimes that's a literal cost, and other times it's a cost of time or attention or resources that get diverted from the very kids in the classroom who are our priority. When we're stacking more and more on top of teachers and school districts and superintendents and staff and our special ed folks, well, at some point something gives. And what begins to give is that time, attention, and the basic fundamental focus of academic success that our kids need in order to succeed. That would be my recommendation or my course of action is let's get rid of all the extra and let's just focus on what our kids so desperately need, and those test results clearly show us that that's the case.
Senator Zach Duckworth, thank you.
Thank you.